We now move on to our second speaker. Our second speaker is Dr. Ramon Clarete, who is the chief of party of the Be Safe project sponsored by the U.S. Department of Agriculture for the benefit of the country's food safety regulatory agencies headed by the Department of Agriculture and the Food and Drugs Administration. Prior to this, Dr. Clarete led the Gas Policy Development Program, or GPDP, supported by the U.S. Department of State, which provided capacity development assistance and policy advice to Department of Energy and related regulators of natural gas in the country. He teaches and does research in international trade at the University of the Philippines School of Economics, where he served as dean from 2013 to 2015. He obtained his PhD economics degree from the University of Hawaii in Manoa. Dr. Clarete took up several short-term economic research and policy assignments under the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, USAID, Asia Foundation for DFAT, and the NEDA. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Clarete.
Thank you. Okay. Good morning to you all. The topic of my presentation today is about on the question of enforcing or facilitating market competition. And I focus on the case of rice in the Philippines in 2019. And as you well know, this is one, I think, of the most troubling reforms that the Philippine government had gone through and had divided basically our people on this matter. So let me start my presentation. Okay, so if you will recall, we had the rice tariffication law sometime in 2019, first quarter, February in fact. And basically, among other things, they liberalized rice imports. Now, RTL is so many things to so many people. As you may know, there were groups of people who clapped when the government enabled this, but there were also those who wanted to reverse it. So it was a very troubling times of our history. And I think it continues to be so. And I will not deal with what this law had affected our economy, but I just want to focus on a very particular issue about it, which is on prices of rice. So this is the rice price puzzle, I call it. So as you know, the rice tariffication law enabled liberalized rice imports by anyone. And rice retail prices did not fall as much. It only fell by 6% from 2018. Palay prices fell by nearly 19%. And those movements of prices basically did not dwell very well for the politics of this, because it looks like farmers are suffering more and then rice consumers did not benefit as much. And the country imported over 3 million tons in 2019, and but rice consumers seems to be not benefiting at all of this particular liberalization. Next, please. Okay, so this is a implicit computation for implicit tariff, which is basically, in layman's terms, some measure of the burden on rice consumers. So as you can see here, it's just a computation between what rice wholesale prices were in 2019 and compare this with what would be in situ warehouse cost of rice, landed cost of imported rice brought to the first warehouse. And we did have, I think, a doubling of the implicit tariff between 2018 and 2019, which is not, seems to be not what we expected for a rice tariffication law or import liberalization. But wholesale prices dropped by 23.53%. It's retail prices that did not drop as much, only by 6%. World rice prices dropped by 40%. Okay, next please. Okay, so it's kind of puzzling for me as somebody looking at this from the economics, because if we would have liberalized rice imports, we economists would say, okay, there would be many who would start importing rice because there's profit from doing so, until we wipe out profits. And that is when rice prices would have fallen to something like 26.82, which is about the world price plus the 35% tariff. But that did not happen. Wholesale prices only dropped by 20% rather than 40%. So it dropped something like around 30, if I'm not mistaken, 34.65. So anyway, and then worse, rice retail prices dropped by only 6%, which is somewhere there near 45.31. Okay, so next, please. Okay, so yeah, all right. This chart is telling us about. Let's check on the data. So we confirm now that there's about 3.1 million tons that were imported in 2019. That's about 20% of supply. There was about 12.305 million tons were harvested according to PSA, and consumption was around 11.819 tons. It does look that this is not the version that I passed. But anyway, about 1/5 of supply was not used. Okay, so there is, I'm sorry about this, but it should be 1/5 now, because I added also the other uses of rice here. Next, please. Anyway, I can still use this particular presentation. Okay, so let's check more comprehensively the data by looking at the supply-use matrix of rice. So what do we have there? The total supply of rice is basically made up of the beginning inventory, the local rice harvested for that particular year, and imported rice. That's supply. And on the use side, we have, of course, the demand for rice, for uses for rice, for replanting, for processing, for animal feeds, and then for inventory. Okay, we have to stock up also for a variety of reasons. And finally, of course, consumption. Now, the uses of rice for planting, for processing, for animal feeds, those are in fixed proportions to local harvest. If I summed it all, nearly 12% of production would go into these other uses. That's a very steady proportion and constant through the years. It is these two elements of the use matrix, of the use of rice, that is the ending inventory and this residual and this consumption, rice as used as food. Now, the practice of PSA is to estimate IE, or the inventory. It was estimated by NFA. Now it is being estimated by, this should be BPI, and carried forward as beginning inventory in the following year. So that's estimated. I'm not sure in 2019 if they did that, because there was a transfer of responsibilities from NFA to BPI. And then consumption, or RC, the rice used as food, that's basically a residual. And but of course, it is usually checked against per capita consumption. It is rising, but not really, fluctuating left and right or up and down. So it's a very steady growth that is in step with population growth, and of course, human per capita consumption. Okay, next, please. What happened here? What happened here? There's. Okay. See, there's something wrong. Okay. Sorry. I should have the one to share my. Okay. All right. Here. All right. I'll pick it up from here. Okay. Can you please project this? Hello. Do you want me to share now? Okay.
Hello, sir. You can share po your screen now.
Okay, I'll do that. Okay. I should do this. Okay. All right. Okay, so let me pick up from here. All right. So given this other uses, so let me move this. This one here, if you follow my mouse, would be about one fifth of the total supply that is not used as consumption for food or other uses. Okay, so let me continue in the next slide. Next slide. Oh, okay. All right. So this one here is the supply use matrix for 2016 to 2018 coming from PSA. And as you can see, this is the uses of other percent of production of other uses. And then looks like this one is estimated by PSA to be the ending stocks. So there's an increase of about 21% of the rice inventory in 2019. And we consumed a lot, of course, higher, 13.364. So this is now the residual. So, okay, now continue. Okay. Now, this is not really something new. I mean, we had very high rice stocks, ending year rice stocks before. Like, for example, in I think this is 2010. Remember, during the Arroyo administration, we imported a lot, NFA did. And then there was lots of rice rotting in warehouses. This is this year here. The Aquino administration also had the second largest end year stocks, which is 3.4 million. Now, if PSAs would be releasing this to be the official end year stocks, this would be the third highest, which is about 3.098 million. Now, there is, however, a difference between these two. Before, it was NFA who was holding those stocks. This time, it is the private sector. NFA is still holding some stocks, but it is no longer empowered as before to participate in the market. Oops. Okay. Now, there are several motivations, of course, for holding inventories. There are useful motivations. We are holding stocks because sometime in the third quarter of the calendar year, local production is basically low. So we prepare for that so that our consumption would be smoothened. That's useful. We have been doing that. We could also have saved some rice for rainy days. But it could also mean that we are stocking, or the private sector is stocking to control the market price and get higher profits. And so this is the one that bothered several people in 2019, that it may be that traders and the importers who were the major beneficiaries of the rice tariffication law. And so higher than usual inventory levels may likely indicate above normal profits. So let me point out again, the difference between before and now is that before it was the NFA who was holding the stocks. Now it's the private sector holding the stocks. And that could signal some imperfect competition, abnormal profits. So let me pursue that one because that's a topic I have, which is, are we going to enforce competition or facilitating competition? Okay. So let me now explain the price puzzle. Remember, this is the price puzzle. Our wholesale prices dropped by 20%. Our farm gate prices dropped also by 20%, or nearly about that. But our retail prices only dropped by 6%. Okay? So something like the equilibrium seemed to be that this one here could have been the wholesale price. Okay? But then some of that were not injected in the market. So if I subtract what might be the inventory increase, its retail prices settled somewhere here, which is just 6% lower than the 2018 retail prices. Okay, because not all, if all imports, all supply were injected into the market, it would have settled here at 34.65. And I think NEDA was expecting this, but that did not happen, of course. Now, but another point I should say is, why did we settle here? In theory, we could settle here at the 26.82, which is the world price plus 35% tax, or somewhere here in between. So there's really an under-importing. I mean, somewhere there is an equilibrium here, and no competition came in to basically bring down these prices further down. Okay, now let me continue with the palay prices. Now, palay prices dropped by about the same percent as wholesale prices. And the way I would explain that is, well, farmers have to unload all their harvest without access, because they don't have access to storage anyway. So buyers, the traders at the farm gate, anticipate that local rice would have to compete with imported rice. So that one is why it may have dropped about the same rate as the wholesale prices. But rice consumers did not benefit that by as much, because some of that rice did not enter into the market. Okay, so here we are now. I'm now approaching my last few slides. The question is, we could enforce competition and we could facilitate competition. Enforcing competition would be something like, now we are going to do some raids of warehouses and basically prosecute those who are hoarding rice. And we have lawyers from PCC, for example, that would charge them in violation of our local competition laws. But for me, it will bring us down all the way to the wholesale prices. as we flush out all those rice from the warehouses. So we will settle from here to here. Facilitating competition would encourage more new entrants into the market or existing players importing more. So this would possibly drive prices even much lower here, and therefore closer to the full equilibrium, which is the world price plus the 35% tax. So this one here, therefore, is increasing consumer surplus, because the consumer surplus for enforcing would just be this one. Well, the enforcing, can you follow my mouse, is larger, okay? Okay, so, and so therefore, enforcing competition laws by punishing by raid is not, I mean, let's look at the rice industry. This is not really an increasing returns to scale industry. It is basically a constant returns to scale industry. And there is no statute after the RTL that prevents anyone from entering this. Okay? So in theory, therefore, the equilibrium that we found in 2019 is not the sustained equilibrium, because statute as well as the nature of the industry allows entrance. But why are the entrants not entering the industry? I would call that entry cost of potential competitors in the trading business that keeps competition weak. Okay? I mean, you know, it requires some experience, some knowledge, and all this, maybe access to finance. Those things are actually barriers, effective barriers for entering the industry. So if we can reduce those entry costs, competition can be promoted. An important matter to point out is that even if the inventory were sold in the market, prices would have only fallen by 20%, half of the 40% decline in world prices in 2019. I had pointed that out in the chart earlier. Okay, before, when NFA was still a player in this market, this was not very much a problem, because NFA can countervail attempts of the private sector to corner the price, by injecting rice into the market at official prices, which tends to be lower. In 2019, that role was no longer there. NFA was only instructed to procure to defend palay prices. That's why we have a lot of procurement going on here, but the release was only very low. And it appears, therefore, that NFA is like in cahoots with the private traders to corner the market, because they couldn't countervail. I mean, in fairness to the NFA, they couldn't countervail anymore because the law prevents them from doing so. So I would say that, I mean, both policy responses of enforcing as well as facilitating do encourage competition. They promote competition, and also they cost resources. I mean, PCC would have to spend resources in order to gather the evidence and prosecute those who are violating competition laws. And even facilitating competition, I mean, you have to build up the capability, capacity of our businessmen to be able to import rice, etc. So, enforcing policymakers force the traders to inject the rice into the market, further reducing rice price. However, resulting rice price will still be above the gross of tariff rice price. So, I say that this seems to be an inferior way of facilitating competition. How, of promoting competition. Facilitating competition would also require resources and promote competition by developing the capacity of entrants to import rice. So I made this point earlier, and let me repeat this because I think this is one of the one I would like to stress. If we just force competition, we would be settling here. But I think if we move on to facilitate competition, we could move even farther here, and there will be more competition in the market. If we look at consumer surplus as an indicator of well-being of the economy, we have a larger consumer surplus with facilitating competition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clarete, for that very enlightening presentation. Now we move to the open forum for our first two speakers. Okay, so we have a question from Dr. Rodelio Subade. This is for Dr. Clarete. In retrospect and assessment, do you say that rice tariffication law was a failure? What do you think its performance was versus its goals or intentions? What do you think of its performance?
I have no doubt it was good for the economy. Even farmers who lost income in that year, okay, for most of the time, they are consumers as well. So the lower prices should benefit them also.
Okay, this is a follow-up question. I think, is the removal of countervailing role of NFA good or bad for the market? For consumers, producers? Please explain.
That particular role is like a palliative given the distorted policy of quantitative import restrictions. Okay, so that is really heavy. I mean, one wrong after another wrong. That's how I see it.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Joel Coelho would like to ask questions. Sir, would you like to air your questions now, please?
Yes, I've got a question for both Dr. Bolongaita and Dr. Clarete. First, for Dr. Bolongaita, thank you for your insightful talk or presentation. And I really appreciated what you referred to as the rise of the algorithmic governments, which is really fascinating. And of course, that is dependent on the social license that the society is willing to offer or to give to their corresponding governments. Now, with autocratic governments like China, there's no problem with this. China can collect all the personal information of its citizens and even foreign citizens in its territory without any pushback. But when it comes to countries that are liberal democracies, even among them, there's a range. Some liberal democracies are more tolerant about encroachment into privacy. And there are countries like the United States, which is the opposite, very intolerant in regard to encroachment into personal privacy. And talking about contact tracing, because we're in the age of COVID-19, for instance, in South Korea, they've been very successful in implementing their own method of contact tracing. But I really doubt that if that is adopted to the United States, there's going to be a lot of pushback on that, because again, the level of social license differs greatly between those two liberal democracies. Can you talk a little bit more about this and give us more insight as to how governments then should approach policy depending on the degree of tolerance of their population when it comes to encroachment of privacy toward, big data and AI and all of these algorithms?
Thank you very much, Dr. Coelho, for that insightful question. The challenge for democratic governments in building social license for the deployment of analytics solutions is, as you rightly noted, much greater than it is for non-democracies. And in certain democracies, and as you know, democracies are not necessarily alike. There are some democracies that are sort of more consensual, as in their institutions, such as in the Scandinavian democracies, as opposed to the some other democracies that are more adversarial, in nature, such as in the United States, no, and one would argue also, in the Philippines and so-called, presidential type of democracies. It's very interesting that the effort to build social license is not necessarily more effective in consensual democracies as opposed to non-consensual democracies. No? It might intuitively seem so, but it's not necessary. So, for example, in Norway, which provides funding, for interest groups, that work, for example, on the subject of climate change. Studies have found that the support for these groups, have actually created an environment that is less critical of government, and therefore arguably less meaningful from a public policy standpoint. So there has been some perverse effects, with respect to the nature of the government support to generate social license for their activities. So it is a very complex issue, as it deals with more complex tools. No? So as governments try to deploy these types of tools in a predictive manner that can have coercive consequences, this can be quite challenging.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Balangaida. For Dr. Clarete, if I could turn to you now. So thank you for elucidating to us the conundrum of the rice tariffication law in the Philippines. It's quite interesting, as you mentioned, that the price of palay went down 19%, but the retail price of rice went down only by 6%. And there seems to be that missing 20% of the rice supply. So it seems to me that indeed the traders and the importers are gaming the system. So my question to you is this legal in the Philippines, or is there a way if they're hoarding and holding the supply, the 20% that seems to be missing, is there a way for law enforcement to prevent that from happening?
Thank you for that very interesting question. Of course, I'm not a lawyer, so I think that's a very challenging task for any lawyer to confront, because it's like, when you stock up, there are good reasons for storing. There could also be unproductive reasons for storing. How do you separate the two? Okay, so that is not for me to answer the question, but it is. It could be the work of the competition lawyers at the PCC.
All right.
Okay, so but definitely, if you have the evidence for it, it is really a conspiracy against the rice consumers, because it's very clearly that they have imported this at a lower price, but then they're selling it at a higher price.
And I have to note that the local farmers are at the losing end as well. Would you agree?
I agree that, because they are also consumers as well. They could have benefited more to offset their losses in income because of the competition provided by imported rice.
All right. Thank you.
Dr. Coelho. Now we have Dr. Balisacan. Dr. Balisacan first, and then Dr. Mangahas and Dr. Pernia.
Thank you, sir. I congratulate the two speakers for very excellent presentation and very informative. Dr. Clarete, the issue of the behavior of farm prices and wholesale prices is indeed intriguing. And you referred to entry costs or barriers to entry as one plausible explanation. But could you be more specific on what those barriers to entry are? Are these barriers created by collusive behavior, or are these policy-induced barriers? Are there still, even though we said that importation has been liberalized, has it indeed been de facto liberalized? Is government still issuing, for example, quarantine issue, this IPS, this license to import, especially for food safety or plant safety issues or considerations? And how are these being managed with all these requests for importation? Are those where the barriers to entry are coming from? Because it's really, indeed quite intriguing, because if you look at the number of importers in 2019, it's increased quite significantly. But we wonder whether, of course, there's the players in the warehousing and distribution sector are the same players in the importing sector. So I think that is a good piece of information that we would need. And but the other issue is, you mentioned that there are no constant returns to scale in the industry. I think we have to be very cautious about that. It's true that in farming, the evidence shows that there are no constant returns. There are constant returns to scale there, but that's not likely to be going to be the case in warehousing and tracking segment of the market. You can see that if you go to Bulacan or Nueva Ecija, and if you look at those interlinkages of markets there, you would see that there must be scale economies there. So that's probably one thing to in fact, Yohiro Hayami mentioned this long time ago, that in the case of tracking, warehousing, marketing in agriculture, there are scale economies. But in terms of agriculture, farming itself, production itself, there's no evidence of scale economies, even in highly agricultural products of high commercial value like pineapple and banana in Mindanao. With respect to Dr. Gaita, I enjoyed listening to your lecture because clearly the algorithmic based markets are quite prominent these days. And we have many issues concerning e-commerce and the use of algorithms in pricing and other market dynamics. But I was hoping to hear from you about the role of antitrust in your discussion of the policy responses of government, apart from mentioning the case in Europe. But as you, I'm sure, are aware, there is a call for a visit on the role of antitrust, even in countries like the US, where it used to be a more defensive of, about the role of antitrust. Now they are revisiting the practice, and many of them are now calling for a more aggressive treatment of the market with respect to antitrust or competition policy. I wonder if you can elaborate on that issue, and I'd be very thankful. Thank you.
Okay. Should I come in first? Thank you, Dr. Balisacan. You had 2 points there in your question to me. The first one is about the policy-induced barriers. And you had mentioned about the issuance of SPS permits. Those continue under the rice tariffication law or import liberalization law, because that is regarding the to protect plants from pests that may be induced by the importation. But that is an automatic import licensing. But it could be abused by PPI, as we have seen in maybe 4 or 3 years ago, when garlic imports was the issue about the issuance of SPS permits were controlled by some groups in the PPI. I think there was a court case against it. So that's precisely what we have to also watch, that there could be some cornering of the market through the issuance, or lack of, or slow issuance of otherwise automatic import licensing. And on the second one, I think on scale economies, I could say that I think that, yeah, I recognize that there are very large warehouses, but you can build your business, I think, from, I mean, when I say that it is basically constant returns to scale, the technology is such that you can scale it up. It's not like, for example, if you are going to go into real increasing returns to scale, for example, in electricity distribution, where you have to really have this kind of initial scale in order for the business to operate. So you need to have a very big, lumpy capital investments right away. But in this kind of business, in trading, you can scale it up until you can maybe start with an initial small scale of warehouse, double it, triple it, or you have make it a big one until when you have already the kind of experience. So that is how I see to be the kind of industry in rice. By the way, I think for the other entry barriers, I think it's basically those who are not in the business yet and they want to enter into the import business. They have to know what the importation is all about, what are the procedures, what would be, how can they access capital. So these are the kinds of capacity development, I think, that I'm talking about, that were not there in 2019 and preventing, therefore, entrants from coming in. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Balisacan, for your question. You are, I think, quite correct to point out that there is a growing effort to apply antitrust laws against big tech firms. No? Clearly, firms like Amazon have become monopolies, no? In the sense that they are able to dictate prices and exclude competition, but they are not. Being a monopoly is not necessarily a violation of antitrust laws. The question is whether their behavior and practices are actually preventing competition from other enterprises. And this is where the recent hearings, actually last week, of Facebook, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft were focused on, and where the regulators, based on documents from these very firms themselves, showed that there were active efforts to actually destroy competition from other firms, using, for example, early acquisition, such as arguably what Facebook did with Instagram. And so I think absolutely correct that we will see increasing attempts at regulation of big tech, but as I think you would be well aware, the power of these big tech, to deploy their own legal capacities to counter regulatory attempts to constrain them would be quite formidable. It'll be battle royale.
Dr. Mangajas, your questions, please.
Yeah. I made a comment there that I think that rice tariffication worked because hunger was very low in December 2019. Now, I'd like to explain that hunger has been measured directly by surveys quarterly since 1998. On the other hand, rice consumption is very irregularly measured and not directly. It's only a residual. So actually, we don't know the real evidence as to how much people are eating in terms of food at all. Now, Dennis Mapa, when he was with the School of Statistics, and his students, in fact, had so many papers showing that the time trend of hunger was closely related to the price of rice. In fact, he estimated lags in terms of the effect of the price of rice on hunger using our estimates of hunger and the estimates of the price of rice, which are, of course, it's easy to estimate. It's easy to observe the price of rice. Even this year, 2020, we have already done 2 surveys of hunger by including them in our mobile phone surveys. So we have not stopped with the surveying of hunger. Okay. Now, what's the general time pattern of hunger? Hunger was relatively low 1998 up to 2003. Then it went up steadily from 2004 and hit a peak about 2014, 15. I call it the hump in hunger. In 2013, 14, we had 20% hunger in the Philippines. Now that sort of simmered down a little bit, 2015, 2016, 17, and finally, as I said, hit this low of 8.8% at the end of 2019. That's a great relief. That's the most important achievement in terms of the food security issue for the people. Right? But unfortunately, this year, because of the breakup in people's livelihoods, we had hunger zooming up again to 17 or 16% in May, and then 20% plus by July. All right, but that's not due to the price of rice. That's due to the sudden squelch in people's incomes. All right. So, to my mind, it's you look at both the prices and you look at the ability to purchase. And this year, it's the ability to purchase which is squeezing people. And for goodness sake, why doesn't the government put some statistical resources into measuring hunger itself directly? Measuring food consumption is actually very, very difficult, to do regularly. But if you're going to do it only once every few years, I think that's hopeless. Measure hunger too. Use whatever you like to do, but go directly into measuring hunger. That's the real test of what's happening to food security. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Before we move on to Dr. Pernia's questions, would you like to comment on that, Dr. Clarete?
No, I think
Okay.
I'll comment maybe later.
Dr. Pernia, your questions, please, sir.
Okay, just a couple of quick questions, which will require also very quick answers. On the rice liberalization law, people seem to be very happy about the law because rice prices have really plummeted, and in fact, in terms of the overall inflation, headline inflation, it has been a material contributor to the to the downtrend in headline inflation. So are you saying that by not just enforcing but also facilitating competition, it will further reduce rice prices and therefore lower overall inflation in general? So that's my question on the rice thing. On Dr. Bolongaita's presentation, I think you mentioned that the contact tracing using technology, the big data and all that, in Korea was very successful, and I think in a couple of other countries as well. But how is it that it's not being used in Australia, in Victoria? There has been a surge in cases, COVID cases in Victoria, right? And even the US has not been using contact tracing by adopting technology. So it's really, and of course in the Philippines, we're not using it either. So it's a mystery to me why it's so simple to use contact tracing using technology, but it's not being used. So thank you. That's all.
Yeah, Dr. Pernia, to the question, yes. When I computed the implicit tariff based on the retail prices that went down only by 6%, or even the wholesale price 20, which is went down by 20%. I mean, it's still around 74%. Okay, is the implicit tariff. I mean, that's the burden that consumers have to shoulder. In other words, there is still room for bringing it down if there were more businessmen who will enter the business of trading, importing.
Thank you, Sec Ernie, for your question. The contact tracing app in Australia called COVID Safe app, was very successfully rolled out. The design, at the outset looked really strong in terms of the privacy considerations, and the social marketing to build social license was highly effective, and the government was able to, within just 2 weeks, achieve their target of almost 40%, and now it's past 40% of the Australian population with smartphones. However, it turns out that there's a technical defect in the app itself, and it turns out that the Bluetooth handshake that is on which the contact tracing depends does not work very well when iPhones are locked. And this partly explains why none of the people who have been infected with COVID in Australia, very, very few have actually been found as a result of contact tracing app. So it's been called now by the opposition here as a big failure of an app. Unlike how it has done, unlike how such apps have done in elsewhere, such as in South Korea, as you mentioned.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for such a stimulating open forum. Should you have any more questions, you can either write them on the chat board. We can read them later in the second open forum.
Answer my question. Ramon has not commented yet on my remark.
So you may air, if you have any questions, so further questions for our two speakers, you may air them orally later in the second open forum after all the presenters are done. Thank you again to our speakers, Dr. Bolongaita and Dr. Clarete. Now we move on to our third speaker. I'm sorry, on the chat board, this is my boss, Dr. Concepcion, Dr. Gislala Concepcion has a question for Dr. Bolongaita.
Oh, thank you. This is quick. I wanted to congratulate both speakers, but in particular, I wanted to ask Emil, as an academic leader, how are you addressing the ethical questions regarding AI data analytics as it major tool in governance. How are you addressing keeping the balance between private, individual interest and public interest? Thank you.
Oh, you're asking the $1 billion question, Professor Concepcion. Indeed, the development and deployment of increasingly, AI-driven tools, that not just use machine learning but deep learning, will really put us into ethical territory in highly complex ways, especially as the development of these tools can even lead to situations where even the designers are not quite sure about how the machines are learning and making prescriptions and decisions. So the realm of ethics and accountability is where I think policymakers and regulators are going to be wrestling with going forward. And this obviously, as you know, will lead policymakers and regulators and citizens to the issue of values, and what values do we have to make sure are protected as we design and develop these tools.
Sarah, could I just quickly, very short, respond to Dr. Mangajas? I do agree with your comment about I'm not happy with how consumption is measured as a residual. These two, in the stocks held and then the consumption held, these are the two things that are very important to understand. And I think if we can just have direct estimation of consumption, as you suggest, maybe the hunger index that you have, and link that to consumption, that would be, I think, a better way of understanding more our statistics. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you. Can we move again? If you have any further questions, you may air them in the second open forum after all the speakers are done.